Today I am joined by Timothy Santel, Senior Advisor at Focus Conservation and a former Special Agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Across a remarkable 32-year career, Timothy led some of the world's largest undercover wildlife crime investigations. From dismantling rhino horn trafficking networks to exposing the illegal trade in big cats. In this episode, we'll explore the evolution of wildlife crime, the realities of undercover investigations, and how innovative law enforcement is helping protect wildlife across the globe. Welcome, Timothy, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, what first sparked your interest in wildlife conservation, and how did that lead you into a career in wildlife law enforcement?
I grew up in the Midwest in the United States, and I kind of grew up in a situation where we didn't have a lot of money. And so we didn't take a lot of vacations and we didn't get to travel very often. I did grow up in an area where we had the outdoors, and the fact that my dad was very active in the outdoors and at a very early age would take me along with him. And the woods and the water were my playground. I would go out and explore. And of course, through my father, who was always talking about animals, spurred a lot of interest for me. And then when I grew up, we didn't have the internet. Really, we had television called Wild Kingdom, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. That came on every Sunday night. So I was always glued to the TV. That particular show highlighted wildlife across the world, and the people on the show would travel to different parts of the world and talk about animals. And so between spending my free time in the woods and also watching this television show and then having a father that always talked about animals, it just seemed like a natural fit that as I grew up, that would sort of be the journey that I would take. And sure enough, that's kind of how it turned out for me.
So most people imagine a career in wildlife conservation as a biologist or a protected area manager. What exactly does a career as a wildlife law enforcement look like?
It's funny you say that because that's exactly what I thought I wanted to do. When I was in school, I was preparing myself to be a wildlife biologist one day. Instead of most foreign languages that students in the U.S. high schools would take, instead of taking Spanish or German or French or something of that nature and learning another language, I actually studied Latin. And the reason I studied Latin was because I felt it would help me understand the genus and species for animals. And I prepared myself growing up to get into that field. And so I went to college, got a degree in wildlife ecology, and was determined that I was going to work as a wildlife biologist. And one of my very first jobs with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service right out of college was actually in law enforcement. And so that was my exposure to law enforcement. And I was in that for about almost 3 years, but I still had this internal desire to be a wildlife biologist. And so an opportunity came up for me to be an endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I actually left law enforcement and became a wildlife biologist. And very soon after I took that new position, I really had a realization that I probably didn't want to be a wildlife biologist anymore. In fact, one of the things that I struggled with was, as a biologist, when you saw things that were going wrong, whether it was a destruction of habitat, the killing of an endangered species, construction projects that were draining wetlands, all those sorts of things, as a biologist, you really didn't have any authority or say to do anything about it other than to raise awareness, maybe reach out and write a letter or make a phone call and hope that somebody else would take action. I just felt that there was a disconnect for me personally. I wanted to be in control when I saw something going wrong or something bad happening. I wanted the ability to do something about it. And so, as a law enforcement officer, when you saw things that were illegal or shouldn't be happening, you had the authority to possibly take action at that time. And so for me personally, I had this desire to get back into law enforcement because I wanted to be able to have a little bit more say in the outcome of situations that I was witnessing. And so I was only a wildlife biologist for about a year before I returned to the law enforcement realm, and I was hired back. And this time I was a special agent, criminal investigator. And my role was a little bit different in the fact that it gave me the authority to investigate wildlife crime throughout the United States. And that, of course, during my career, transitioned into investigations around the world globally. And of course, in my 30 years or so in doing that job, I was successful in being able to take action when I saw things going wrong and illegal activity taking place. And it was the right move for me. It may not be the right move for everyone, but for me personally, I just felt law enforcement was my calling. And I didn't realize that until after I was a biologist.
So, over the course of your career, how has wildlife trafficking evolved from isolated poaching incidents into more sophisticated international criminal syndicates?
Yeah, when I started in my career, and in fact, the law enforcement officers for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they're over 125 years old. I've been doing this job for over a century. But when some of the first laws were passed that were protecting wildlife, the main focus was on hunting, fishing, and lower level crimes that really centered on poaching and to some degree a little bit of market hunting and commercialization. And that transition throughout the decades. And then in the 1970s, that's when the United States passed the Endangered Species Act. And then subsequently, the CITES Convention was ratified and countries joined, and a bunch of other federal and global international protections started being placed on animals. And for me personally, I became an agent in the early 90s. And what I saw was a transition from, like I said, lower level crimes, some commercialization, some trafficking. But I think with the creation of the internet, really wildlife crime and wildlife trafficking exploded globally. Because if you think about it, in the old days, if I wanted to acquire or buy an endangered species or try to collect something illegal or something that was rare or protected in another part of the world, it was extremely difficult because you had no way to figure out how to get it. We did have phones, but who were you going to call and how were you going to figure out who had these items? The internet and the ease of locating species, learning about species, finding out where they were, took off when the internet was created. And so now I can sit in the United States and with this a few clicks, I can be in touch with people from around different parts of the world. I can have conversations, I can wheel and deal, and I can get access to species that I would have never been able to get a hold of before. And now you can negotiate, you can arrange deals, you can pay for it online. You never have to meet the person face to face. And with a few clicks, the money gets sent over and the item arrives at your doorstep. And so the ease of moving animals and brokering deals has really changed the face of wildlife trafficking. It's made it a lot easier, and it's really impacted species because species that were unknown or just the ease of getting it just wasn't easy to get your hands on them. Now it's pretty easy. And so we're seeing that change dramatically. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's just so easy now to connect with people from all parts of the world and get access to species that decades ago, or at least when I started, it wasn't easy at all.
So, what similarities have you seen between wildlife trafficking networks and those networks involved in narcotics, money laundering, human trafficking, or even weapon trading?
Yeah, that too has transcended over the course of my career. We commonly see now the larger, complex, transnational crimes involving wildlife are typically linked to organized crime. And we call it convergence. And convergence really is a term that gets thrown around, but it really means when the bad guys are operating, they don't just operate in a silo and they just concentrate on one crime. Many times they're intertwined and they're linked. And those that are involved in narcotics trafficking or human trafficking, arms trafficking, many times will also have their hands involved in wildlife trafficking. And because if you think about it, the one thing that motivates the bad guys is money. And so they don't really care how they make their money, whether it's from a tiger skin or a bear gallbladder or the fin from a shark, or if it's an AK-47 or it's heroin or it's young girls being put into prostitution rings for human trafficking. The bad guys don't care. They're motivated by money and greed. And so it just kind of goes hand in hand that wildlife trafficking in many respects is intertwined with other crimes. And I saw that throughout my career. In fact, I was involved in a number of fairly significant and complex investigations that had other crimes overlapping with wildlife crime. And that included everything from mail fraud and bribery to, again, narcotics, everything else. It's something that I don't think people equate wildlife crime to some of these other crimes. But when you're talking about billions of dollars in illegal wildlife trafficking taking place, it's natural that some of these criminal organizations are going to have their hands in this as well. And in fact, one of the situations that pops into my mind now as we're talking about this is there was a group out of Ireland. Basically, they were out of Rathkeil, Ireland, and they were an organized criminal group that they were, for lack of a better terms, opportunistic. They were gypsies. They traveled the world and they went from scam to scam. And so whatever was hot at the time where they could make money for their group, that's what they concentrated on. And I think in 2010, they started realizing that there was some very lucrative motivations to get involved in the illegal trade of rhino horn. And so if you think about it, it's odd this group that one day is involved in other crimes decides they're going to start trafficking in rhino horn. And so in 2010, they started to get themselves involved in the theft of rhino horns from various museums across Europe. I believe there were over 100 rhino horns that were stolen from natural history museums and some pretty prestigious institutions and museums in Europe. And so the Europeans got involved and started investigating it. And I think they called it Operation Oakleaf. But my counterparts there in Ireland and the UK and other parts of Europe started looking into the thefts of all these rhino horns being taken from museums. And that sort of opened up their eyes to the fact that there was a huge desire and uptick in trafficking of rhino horns. And then that information was relayed to me when I was an agent with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And to the extent that during their investigation there in Europe, they caught wind that the Irish were actually also traveling to the United States to secure rhino horns. And I started looking into them and was tipped off that a couple of individuals were arriving in the United States from Ireland to look for rhino horn specifically. And so this actually took place in January of 2011. And I put together a really small team to conduct surveillance of two individuals that arrived in St. Louis, Missouri from Ireland. And that was really the genesis of what later became a pretty significant, maybe the largest wildlife trafficking investigation in U.S. history, at least for the Fish and Wildlife Service, in a case called Operation Crash. But that was really instigated by this information that I received from my European counterparts and involved, like I said, the Irish. But we see an overlap of crimes from a variety of different criminal organizations around the globe, whether they're from Africa or Southeast Asia, Europe, South America, and the United States. It doesn't matter. There are groups that are heavily involved in trafficking of wildlife, ranging from shark fins and caviar to elephant ivory, rhino horn, coral, the live pet trade. The list is endless.
Continuing on about the rhino horn trade, and this question probably relates to ivory and other wildlife products more broadly. There's been a significant amount of effort to reduce the illegal trade by demand reduction campaigns. How effective do you think these have been in reducing wildlife trade, and Do you think there are any other interventions which can help prevent the trade from happening rather than proactively tackling criminals?
I'm a law enforcement guy. And for me, I operate on the premise that we got to create a deterrence. It doesn't make any sense to have laws and regulations if they're not being enforced. But to put things in perspective, when you're a law enforcement officer, particularly in the wildlife arena, it's extremely difficult. These cases are very difficult. First of all, I can speak for the United States, but also around the world, laws and regulations, if they're on the books, they're usually complicated. They're usually riddled with loopholes and gray areas. And so it makes things really difficult from an enforcement standpoint because we're required to jump through a bunch of hoops in order to make these cases. But if you kind of want to think about it, first of all, you have difficult if you have laws, because many countries don't even have laws that prevent or prohibit these things from happening. But if you have taking the United States for an example, we have some pretty strong laws, but they have a lot of exemptions, a lot of exceptions, a lot of gray area. And so we work through all that, and you finally are working the bad guys, and you put a case together, you're collecting evidence. Now you have to present that case to a prosecutor. And we're competing with, and when you bring a case into the prosecutor's office, as an officer, I'm competing with all the other crimes that are being committed around the country. And so that's ranging from terrorism to money laundering to fraud and murder, drugs, guns. And so why would a prosecutor want to take a wildlife case? And many times wildlife is just not seen as significant as some of these other crimes. And so that's also a challenge to an officer, is getting a prosecutor that's willing to take your case. And then when you do find a prosecutor that's willing to take your case and move forward with prosecution, now you have to deal with the judicial system, which is also extremely challenging. And now you have judges that maybe have never heard a wildlife case before. And so you're presenting something that's brand new. They don't have a lot of knowledge about it. And maybe they have their own preconceived ideas about wildlife and its level of importance. Maybe it's not important to them. And so that's another challenge, is not only once you get that case in the court, you have to get it, you want to convict somebody, and you want to get a judge to rule for a conviction. And then let's assume that all that happens and you actually get a conviction. Now you have to try to convince a judge to put somebody in prison. And so that's a challenge, because let's face it, the penalties for poaching a tiger is not seen in the same as maybe murdering a person. And so that's an obstacle and a challenge, because the sentencings are typically. And so where I'm going with this is we have a lot of challenges, but at the end of the day, my goal is to put the bad guy in prison and create a deterrence where you don't make it worth the risk. But there's so many other things that play into this. If you think about it, the socioeconomic status in some of these countries, you have situations where people have a very hard time raising their families under the current standard of living in these countries. And many times the criminal organizations, syndicates, groups, they prey upon people to go out and do their poaching for them. And so people are presented with opportunities to make some money that they may not have been able to make through their regular course of their regular job or whatever the situation may be. And if you think about it, you're living across the road from a national park in Africa, and somebody approaches you from maybe a syndicate, or an organization approaches you from Hong Kong or wherever the case may be, and asks you to supply them with rhino horns. And the money that they're offering is 10, 50 times what you would normally make in a year. Some people feel that the risk is worth it because you're going to be able to feed their families. And so you're also, these socioeconomic situations make it hard for people to turn down those opportunities. And that's why, for me, it's very important that we create a deterrence, and that we just don't make it just can't be worth the risk. If I know I'm going to lose my money, I'm going to lose my assets, I'm going to lose my freedom and go to prison, I would think twice before maybe accepting some of these offers. And of course, corruption is a big problem for us. You can have a lot of laws and even enforcement efforts, but sometimes, and I know this firsthand, we deal with corruption and politics and things intertwining themselves into these investigations. And that makes it very difficult. And so, regardless of the fact that there are some laws on the books, there's just because you have a law doesn't mean it's cut and dried, black and white, and it's fairly easy to put people in prison. It's just not that easy. And there are a lot of obstacles and challenges. But of course, as I said earlier, I'm a law enforcement guy, so I want to see laws in place. I want to see laws enforced. And I want to see people prosecuted and put in prison when they violate those laws. And hopefully that would deter people from taking part in some of these activities.
Now let's go back to your first ever undercover operation to tackle wildlife crime. What is this case about, and how was your experience in your first ever case?
Oh, wow. When U.S. Fish and Wildlife Special Agents are plain clothes, and when I say plain clothes, is basically we're covert. You don't wear a uniform, you don't advertise who you are, you kind of just blend in, and you work in some respects in an undercover capacity. We do work both overtly and covertly. When you work covertly, undercover work is not for everybody. It's extremely difficult, it's challenging, it's dangerous, and you really got to be at the top of your game in order to be successful because of the risk that are involved. And unfortunately, if you're like me, when I graduated from the academy, I had my badge and my gun, and I thought, okay, that's all I need. I'm going to go save the world and save some animals, and I'm going to start working undercover. I had virtually no experience working undercover, and I thought I did. I thought I could do it. And so the very first, and I can relay this into another situation, but the very first time I tried to be undercover, it was a classic fail. I was in Michigan at my first duty station, and I had received information that there was some illegal wildlife being trafficked out of a bait shop where they were selling various sporting goods and so forth. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to go there and I'm going to talk to them and I'm going to go buy some of this illegal wildlife. And having never done this before, I walked into this bait shop and started a conversation with the owner who was on the other side of the counter from me. And almost immediately, I froze. I forgot what I wanted to say. I got extremely nervous. I start fumbling with my words. And when he says, well, is there something you want? I said, yeah, I want that fishing lure. And I bought a fishing lure and I walked out of the bait shop, and that was it. That was my big covert contact. My very first undercover contact is I bought a fishing lure. And actually to this day, and that was probably 30 something years ago, to this day, that fishing lure hangs on the mirror of my vehicle as a reminder to me of how I failed and how much I needed to be better prepared to work undercover. And so, of course, I took from that I couldn't just wing it. I had to have a cover story. I had to be believable. I had to know what I was going to say. I had to feel comfortable. And so I became a lot more prepared for future undercover work for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Soon after that, I actually started an investigation called Operation Bandit in Illinois, in which I was, and it wasn't a huge case, but it was my very first undercover case that I actually interacted with the bad guys, made some deals, bought some illegal wildlife, and at the end of the day was able to prosecute somebody as a result. And it was that experience that sort of gave me confidence that I could work undercover. And then I had close to a 32-year career. As it turned out, over the next 3 decades, undercover work was my thing. I was pretty successful at it. I worked a lot of undercover cases throughout the United States and even in Canada, and some pretty big investigations for the Fish and Wildlife Service as a result of the efforts of working undercover. But yeah, going back to that very first one, that was a classic failure there in Michigan. And it wasn't until I was able to do the Operation Bandit case that I get the confidence to continue that. And then shortly after my Operation Bandit, I was able to kick off probably one of the largest big cat killing investigations ever done. It was a case called Operation Snowplow. And that case was initiated in 1997 and based on some information I had received from an informant that indicated there was a group of individuals operating in Chicago who were killing big cats. And when I say big cats, I'm talking about killing lions and leopards and tigers and jaguars and cougars, killing them in cages and selling their body parts for profit. And so I initiated this undercover investigation called Operation Snowplow. And it was just a 2-person operation. It was me and my partner. And we worked this group for about a year and a half, witnessed the killings, witnessed the parting out of their carcasses to the various markets, bought and sold cats with the bad guys, captured some of it on video, including the actual shooting and the killing of these animals, and then ended up prosecuting, I think, 17 successful prosecutions, 16 individuals and 1 business. The business was a meat market operating in the Chicago area that was buying the carcasses from these dead cats and then falsely labeling the meat and selling the meat in the meat market, which is a whole nother story. That was an extremely successful operation. And it really was the first time that I became exposed to not only working undercover, but using audio and video surveillance techniques and equipment. This was in the late 90s. And truthfully, Fish and Wildlife Service, we were still kind of in our infant stages of trying to do this kind of work on a large scale in an undercover capacity. And so we didn't have access to a lot of audio and video equipment in the late 90s. And so I actually was friends with the FBI agent, and he introduced me to someone with the FBI that was part of their tech team. They put in the undercover video recording devices and all this sort of thing. And he explained to me the importance of trying to capture these tiger killings on audio and videotape. And so he actually lent me or allowed me to borrow some equipment from the FBI. And so I borrowed a pinhole camera from the FBI. And I actually set up this pinhole camera inside of a stock trailer that we were using to transport live tigers and lions and leopards and so forth. And so I put this recording device inside this trailer, and that is where we were able to, as a result of this pinhole camera that the FBI gave me, I was able to actually capture some of these shootings that took place inside the trailers. And that helped, of course. There's no better evidence than the capturing the audio and video killing of these tigers by the bad guys. And that was all in the early stages of my career. I had only been an agent for about 5 or 6 years before I kicked off the Operation Snowplow tiger killing case. And of course, because of the success of that case, there was changes in legislation. There was a widespread focus on canned hunts and killing big cats, parting species out for their various body parts. And as it relates to the tigers that were killed, these bad guys were purchasing a live tiger from a breeder or a circus, and they would shoot it, and they take that $1,000 tiger and they would shoot it, and they would part out the body parts, and they would sell the skulls, the gallbladders, as I mentioned, the meat, the claws, the hides. And so by the time it was all said and done, that tiger that they bought for $1,000 and killed it now brought them $10,000 in return. And if you think about it, they didn't have to feed it. They didn't have to house it. They didn't have to worry about it killing them in a cage. All they did was shoot it and part it out, and they were making money. And I think in Operation Snowplow, we documented around 70-something animals that were shot and killed by this group. And most of them were probably killed for trophies, to be mounted for trophy hunters, their rooms in their homes and so forth. Snowplow was sort of I had a lot of confidence, gained a little bit of a reputation of doing some good work in the undercover world. And so then I was tasked with doing a lot of undercover work. And years later, because of my reputation and ability to do some of this undercover work, I worked in Canada for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, where I helped them infiltrate a group of Americans who were illegally working in Canada as hunting guides, and was very successful with the Canadians, helping them. And then later I was asked to head up Operation Crash, which was probably the largest rhino horn trafficking case ever done in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and extremely successful. And that work that I was doing on Operation Crash allowed me to work about 40 separate investigations undercover. Not only myself, but I put a team together that worked about 40 different investigations in Operation Crash, most of them undercover. And so it was huge. We had a lot of bad guys. And as a result, I was asked to head up the country's special investigations unit, which was the undercover unit or the covert unit for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As the head of that unit, I had about 10 agents working with me that I was able to bring in, and this team that we put together. And we started working wildlife trafficking crime globally, partnering up with other countries and investigating the large-scale trafficking by criminal organizations and transnational groups. And again, it was something that evolved throughout my career. But back in 1992, when I messed up that bait shop covert contact all the way till 2020 when I retired, I obviously got a lot more experience and had a heck of a lot more success at the end of my career than I did at the beginning. But yeah, undercover work was extremely important in being successful in my role as a special agent for the Fish and Wildlife Service.
So one of your lesser known cases was the work on the pallid sturgeon. Can you just talk about this case and what impact did it have on the broader conservation of the species?
Yeah, a lot of times I think people don't always appreciate law enforcement and the importance, not only that law enforcement, the role they play in apprehending the bad guy, but they can also affect change. I was fortunate. A lot of the cases that I worked in my career were important in the sense that they resulted in congressional changes in laws and regulations, executive orders, awareness to issues. But as it relates to the pallid sturgeon, pallid sturgeons are an endangered species. They're listed on our endangered species list here in the United States. And one of the reasons being is sturgeon, and particularly the pallid sturgeon, there was a huge demand for their eggs for the caviar industry. And back in the day before the Soviet Union broke up, and particularly in that part of the world, in Russia and Europe, caviar was a highly sought after luxury item for the rich. And it was something that people wanted and was made readily available, really controlled in a lot of respects by the Soviet Union, who had control of the Caspian Sea and some of the larger habitats for sturgeon species in that part of the world. When the Soviet Union broke up, and now individual countries had access to the Caspian Sea and other locations where sturgeon existed, if you think about it, instead of one country controlling the fisheries, now you had multiple countries that had different laws and different restrictions. Some had no restrictions. And so there was a huge fisheries effort for the sturgeon. And so everybody was trying to get sturgeon to the point where the populations crashed and dwindled. And many of the sturgeon species were soon extirpated or in danger, or there was a potential for them to become endangered due to overfishing. And so the reason I bring that up is that's now that the sturgeon eggs were so hard to come by, but the demand was still there, the caviar industry had to transition to other species. And they found the paddlefish, which was a species that was prevalent in the United States, in addition to paddlefish. And so there were sturgeon species as well as paddlefish that provided caviar for the industry. When we're talking about the pallid sturgeon, they're on our endangered species list. My team had a significant impact is pallid sturgeon and shovel-nosed sturgeon lived in the same river systems in the United States, particularly the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. And if you think about it, the pallid sturgeon is endangered, but the shovel-nosed sturgeon was not. And so there was illegal fisheries for the shovel-nosed sturgeon. So when the commercial fishing industry went out to try to capture and collect shovel-nosed sturgeon for their eggs for the caviar industry, they were placing their nets out into the waters and also capturing pallid sturgeon. Maybe they weren't the targeted species, but they certainly were a bycatch or a result of these efforts to catch shovel-nose. And so what had happened was I had been contacted by a fish market that were processing sturgeon that had been brought to the market. And while they were processing the sturgeon, they actually located a transponder inside the body of one of these sturgeon. And so they called me because they thought I would be interested to know that they found one of our transponders. It wasn't one of our transponders. And after a little investigating, I determined that this transponder was actually part of a research project being done by a university on the endangered pallid sturgeon. And that was really the first time that I became aware that pallid sturgeon were being captured and collected and sold to fish markets. And so I was determined to look into this and see how big of a issue this particularly was. And so I sent out my team of agents who worked with me. We went out on the Mississippi River and to basically do surveys of nets and fishermen and trying to determine if pallid sturgeon were inadvertently being captured and collected by commercial fishermen. And we were able to document quite a number of pallid sturgeon that were in the bag, for lack of a better term, of these commercial fishermen. And it was difficult because it's hard to tell the difference between a pallid sturgeon and a shovel-nose. And again, one was on the endangered species list and one was not. And I brought this to the attention of the biologists working for the Fish and Wildlife Service. We provided them with our data. We provided them with the information we determined during our surveys out on the water and our contacts with commercial fishermen. And as a result, the shovel-nosed sturgeon was also listed on the endangered species list under similarity of appearance. And so that's a pretty cool story in the sense that now we were able to better protect the pallid sturgeon because the shovel-nose now are also listed on under the Endangered Species Act and can no longer be commercially fished for their eggs or their meat. And so that's just one of a number of stories where law enforcement had an impact on protecting a species, even though it didn't necessarily mean that we had to arrest somebody, but we were able to bring that information and make biologists aware, and they were able to affect the Endangered Species Act. So that was one of the successful stories that we were able to do during my time.
What are the risks involved in wildlife crime enforcement operations?
Wildlife agents, wildlife officers, whether you're state or federal, it's a dangerous job. If you think about it, a lot of times you're dealing with people that more than likely are armed, have weapons. Of course, they like to kill animals. A lot of times you're in secluded areas. There's not a huge backup. You don't have a team of backup officers that are waiting to provide assistance when needed necessarily. And so it's an inherently dangerous job. And throughout my career, I found myself in a number of situations that were risky, dangerous, sometimes even a little scary. But it was what I wanted to do. And sometimes I pose the question, are you willing to die for an animal? That's the question. And that's what's sort of the thing that I think about when you're working these kind of cases. Are you willing to die for an animal? Am I willing to risk my life to save that tiger that's going to be shot in a cage? And throughout my career, I found myself in some of those scenarios where it got a little hairy, it got a little scary. a number of things that pop into my mind as far as dangerous. For example, I told you about Operation Bandit, kind of that very first real successful undercover I did. I did that by myself. I had zero backup. Nobody knew where I was. I didn't tell people I was meeting with the bad guys. I didn't have a backup team. I was doing it by myself. And as it turned out, the individual that I was working undercover was a really bad guy. And I didn't realize that. I realized that after the first time I met him. I had agreed to meet him in a parking lot at a McDonald's restaurant, and we had never met before. And when I saw an individual walking down the sidewalk, he didn't have any shirt on, he didn't have any shoes on, he had just cut blue jeans. He was wearing cut blue jean shorts, and he was full body tattoos, arms and chest and everything. And I'm thinking, and he walked up and jumped into my truck. And I couldn't help but think, I don't know anything about this guy. I've never met him before. I didn't even know who he was and what his name was. So I really wasn't able to do any background on him. And long story short, as it turned out, while I was working him and buying wildlife from him illegally, he disappeared because he committed an armed robbery and was sent to prison for 8 years. So I had thought that he had just ghosted me, and I ended up closing the case because he wasn't responding to any of my covert contacts anymore. And I just thought I guess it didn't work. As it turned out, while I was working him, he committed an armed robbery, was caught, and was sent off to prison. Later on, I was able to apprehend him again, arrest him, and I actually put him in prison. But he was a bad guy that I was working that I had absolutely no business working because I didn't do my homework. I didn't vet him. I didn't know anything about his background. And certainly he was involved in some other serious crimes. But those kind of people I dealt with pretty routinely. And you always had to worry about those dangers. Of course, I certainly was a lot smarter as the years went by. Back up, I knew the people I was dealing with, and we took precautions to make sure we minimized danger. But there was always danger. And when you're wearing a body wire and people want to see if you're wired or if you're in a room, there's still time for bad things to happen before your backup can arrive. There were always dangers. But for me, it was the adrenaline, there was excitement. I always just thrived on the catching the bad guy. To me, that was something that motivated me. When they did these kind of activities, I saw it as a challenge. And maybe it was I love sports and I love winning and I hate losing. And I think that probably transcended into my career. And I saw it as a challenge and I always wanted to win. And so the risks were just part of that. And I was willing to take those risks when I was doing this work.
So after you retired as a wildlife law enforcement officer, you joined Focused Conservation as a senior advisor. What motivated you to join the organization, and what are some of the key projects being worked on by Focused Conservation?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about focused conservation. As we mentioned, I had a 32-year career, and I worked at an extremely high level, a lot of adrenaline, a lot of success. And that was really all the way up into the end. I ended up retiring in December of 2020. And it's just hard to walk away when you're operating at such a high pace, successful career. It's just hard to turn off the lights, close the door, and walk away and do something else. And the question of why I joined Focused Conservation, a few years before I retired, I had mentioned I was the special agent in charge of the Special Investigations Unit. So I ran the Undercover Unit for Fish and Wildlife. And during that time, we initiated an undercover investigation in East Africa. And it was on probably the largest rhino horn trafficker in East Africa, an individual by the name of Mwaza Kroma. And he ran a syndicate there out of East Africa. He was involved in trafficking rhino horns and elephant ivory and narcotics. But during that investigation, and due to the complexities of working undercover and trying to get information, intelligence, evidence, and do all that stuff in a foreign country, we had to rely on people in those countries to provide us with help and assistance. It was during that investigation that I became aware of and later introduced to an individual by the name of Wim Brown. Wim Brown was my counterpart, as it turned out, for the US DEA. And Wim was assigned to the US Embassy in Kenya. And while Wim was in Kenya, his focus was, of course, investigating the cartels and international narco terrorists and traffickers, people involved in trafficking narcotics around the world. And so the reason I became aware of Wim was the fact that Moaza Kroma, who we were now investigating, was alleged to also be involved in trafficking narcotics. And in speaking with Wim and trying to get some assistance from the DEA there in Kenya, we decided to work together in a joint operation. And Wim and his team and his agency, and along with Fish and Wildlife Service and our local counterparts there in Uganda, we put together a very successful covert operation that concluded with the arrest of Moaza Kroma, which is a whole nother large story in itself. But my interaction with Wim, we developed a friendship. And after I retired, I learned that Wim also retired around the same time. And while he was in Africa, Wim observed wildlife. He became very fascinated with wildlife, and he became very concerned about the illegal wildlife trade that seemed to be so prevalent throughout Africa. And he thought to himself, if we can catch narco terrorists, if we can catch drug dealers using a DEA model of joint task force, if we can use a joint task force after the DEA to catch wildlife traffickers, we should be able to be just as successful. And so to carry out that, when he retired, he created his own nonprofit organization called Focus Conservation. And he did that in 2018. And with the goal of using the tactics, intelligence, and methods to catch drug dealers and apply that to wildlife traffickers. And so Wim started putting together a team of former investigators who not only were successful in their careers, but also had international experience and knew how to work bad guys in foreign countries. And so Wim started bringing on various former investigators from the US and the UK and asked these officers to join Focus Conservation in this global effort to dismantle wildlife traffickers. And Wim approached me. And based on our previous interaction during the Moaza Kroma investigation, he asked if I would join Focus Conservation and help their organization. I agreed. I jumped on board with Wim and been with Wim and his team now for about 3+ years. And the work that this team is doing is really unique when you look at the big picture, the big conservation arena. I dare say there's probably no other organization that is taking the same tack that Focus is, in the fact that we're all former investigators. So we're not a bunch of conservationists, biologists, activists. We're cops. We catch bad guys. And we're taking that and we're helping initiate and mentor law enforcement task force in African countries to take on wildlife trafficking. And as a result, we've had some extreme success in a number of countries in Africa where we've been able to help create these task force in Kenya, Liberia, South Africa, Uganda, and Nigeria. And I think to date, since 2018, which isn't that long ago, we've had over 1,000 law enforcement operations. We have arrested probably close to 800 that are involved in trafficking wildlife. Now, granted, a lot of these traffickers are probably the lower tier traffickers. They're the poachers. They're the bad guys. But they're the ones that are being hired by the criminal organizations or the upper echelons of these syndicates that are involved in trafficking. But we are working with our peers who have helped themselves involved in these wildlife task force, and we're mentoring them. We're sitting with them essentially around the clock, 24/7, which is something that no other organization is really doing. We're there with them. We embed ourselves into these task force. And so we're there at the table giving advice, providing opinions, giving them guidance, showing them how to conduct investigations, how to do scenes, how to do forensics, how to use technology to investigate. And as a result, we've had a lot of success in these countries. The species that we've unfortunately have seen quite a bit of are pangolins, elephant ivory, rhino horn. We've seen shark fin. We've seen illegal timber logging, sandalwood, abalone, and then the live animal trade, which really, I believe there's been over 3,000 live animals rescued by the Focus Conservation and the crime units. And we're talking everything from the African gray parrots and a live manatee to various primates and reptiles, and probably the ones that hit home and hit the hardest, the great ape trade. We're talking about live chimpanzees, live gorillas being trafficked for the pet trade, for the live trade, leaving the jungles of Africa and getting routed through the Middle East and into Southeast Asia and other places. Those are the kind of cases that we're working alongside, rubbing shoulders with these officers from various agencies within these African countries. And it's just been extremely successful. The downside of this nonprofit world is unfortunately everything's tied to funding. And so that's been the sort of the eye-opening experience for me as someone who came from working for a government agency and not having to think about that kind of a thing. Today, Focus Conservation funding and support from donors, getting support from agencies and government agencies and so forth in these countries, it's just paramount to the success that we hope to have. So we've not only are we out there trying to infiltrate traffickers, mentoring, guiding, and helping arrest and prosecute wildlife traffickers, the other side of that is we're also trying to get the word out about wildlife, the trade, the illegal wildlife trade, trafficking going on, species that are in trouble, like the pangolin, the most trafficked mammal in the world. We're trying to get the word out. And that's really where my role is with Focus Conservation. Wear a variety of hats, but I think the one that I take a lot of pride in is being able to tell their story, tell the story about the men and women on the front lines that are risking their lives there in Nigeria to help save a baby gorilla, and making sure that the world knows the sacrifices and the challenges involved in trying to disrupt the illegal wildlife trade. There's just countless conservation organizations that all have a very similar goal and mission in trying to save species and reduce the demand for wildlife, in particular the illegal wildlife trade. But our approach is unique, and I think it's one that resonates because we are seeing results. We are there with, like I said, the men and women who are involved in these task force. And really our goal and the way we look at it is if we can spend a few years shoulders with our counterparts in Nigeria or Uganda or Kenya or someplace, our goal is at some point we can walk away. We've now helped mentor them, train them, give them the confidence and the awareness to do these investigations on their own without us. And they don't all have access to the same things per se that we do in the UK or the United States, but they're extremely passionate and want to learn. And by us doing what we're doing in these task force, we are making changes in these countries in the way that wildlife crime is being viewed. Recently, I was advised by someone who lives in Nigeria that prior to Focus Conservation having a presence in Nigeria, they never heard and certainly were never aware of the illegal wildlife trade, and to the extent that it was happening there in Nigeria. And not only now are they aware and have an extreme interest in this, but we're seeing Nigeria is passing new laws to protect endangered species. And there's a real for wildlife protection now in Nigeria that they didn't see before we started working with the Nigerian Special Wildlife Office, this crime unit. And so, yeah, we're seeing those successes translate as well. But yeah, Focus Conservation, we're very small. There's probably less than 10 of us for the whole organization. Because of that, it's been a challenge trying to gain traction in this arena. It's been a challenge to be seen and heard, especially when you're battling, not necessarily battling, but your other organizations that are in this arena are much larger, have a bigger footprint. They have marketing departments and grant writers and lobbyists. They're constantly on social media telling every little thing they do. And so there's an awareness to them. And so it's a challenge for a small organization like Focus Conservation to be noticed. But I think the work we do in comparison, in many respects, goes far beyond what some of these large organizations are doing. And so I'm very proud to be associated with Focus Conservation. I'm appreciative that Wim Brown and my fellow team members with Focus, I'm proud of the work that we're doing. And hopefully we'll continue to be supported and funded and be able to not only continue the work in the countries we're in, but maybe help new crime units be developed and mentored in other countries operating in Africa as well.
So how can individuals contribute to focused conservation?
Of course, we have a website. It's www.focusconservation.org or org. We do have social media presence on all the typical social media platforms. Follow us in that way. But through our website, we have a donations page. But if there's donors or someone that has a real interest in supporting an organization like ours, you can certainly reach out to myself or any of the people within the organization. And we would love to talk about what we do and how we might be able to use not only financial support, which is obviously critical to these law enforcement operations, but also support just in getting the word out and letting people know what we are doing and the success we are having. But we can use support from a variety of people, from small to corporations. And so, yeah, there are a variety of ways to get a hold of us.
The question is, what have been some of your most memorable moments from your law enforcement career, wildlife law enforcement career?
Oh gosh, that's a loaded question. I've had so many fantastic memories. I worked with so many fantastic people throughout the country, around the world. I think about a lot of the animals that I had to personally witness being trafficked or killed during my covert work. I think about the training. I spent about 20 years doing international training in which I got to travel to a number of countries throughout the world to sit down with fellow officers and train them, teach them about everything ranging from crime scene evaluations to how to extract digital evidence off of a cell phone to how to conduct an investigation, write a report, do interviews, how to look for evidence. Those experiences, to me, I think the thing that I take away the most is when I interacted with, and it didn't matter if it was a frontline ranger from Uganda or a park ranger from Nepal or a game protector from the Ukraine, when I would sit and talk with these fellow officers, I soon realized that they were no different than me. They had very similar passions, very similar ambitions, same challenges, same concerns. There were subtle differences. Of course, some of us spoke different languages. Some of us had different skin color. Some of us came from different backgrounds. But at the end of the day, we all cared about the same stuff. Our goal was to try to do what we could to save some wildlife for future generations. I take that away. I think that was a huge eye-opening thing for me, was to realize that there were people just like me living in foreign countries that were willing to risk their lives for an animal. And then I guess the other thing that just comes to mind is I've got a lot of awards and recognition during my 3+ decades of working in this arena. I think back, I was named the very first federal wildlife officer to receive the North American Wildlife Officer of the Year. That was in 2004. And the memory that I take from that is I was able to take my family. I had 2 little kids at the time, and I took them to Winnipeg, Canada, to accept this award on stage in front of hundreds of my peers. And I was able to bring my kids and my wife up on stage to accept this award, the Officer of the Year for North America, which is a pretty prestigious award. I received the Guy Bradley Award, which is the highest award honoring wildlife protectors. And then when we did Operation Crash, we got a lot of awards, but the one that was probably the coolest is our team received, it's called the Sammys, but it's basically the Emmy Award for federal service. And the investigation, the rhino horn investigation, was voted by the American people as the People's Choice Award for the most important investigation that year. And so I was able to go to this black tie affair in Washington, D.C., and be part of a team. Our team was accepted this prestigious award on stage there in Washington, D.C., which was pretty cool. But yeah, I got so many memories, so many cool memories. But at the end of the day, I just think about it. I was just a kid, as I said early on, I was a kid that grew up with nothing in the middle of the United States, who spent my days and nights hanging out in nature, in the outdoors. And I went from that to traveling the world and meeting people that had same interest and love for wildlife as I did. And heck, if I could do it, it just goes to show anybody can do it. And it was a great career. I would do it again in a heartbeat. I have no regrets. And yeah, a lot of cool memories trying to save some species.
So that was the final question I had for you today. Thank you so much for taking time out for this podcast.
Thanks for your interest in some of the work being done, not only in my career, but just wildlife law enforcement in general. There's a lot of people that walked before me and a lot of people that are walking after me doing the same thing. And people need to know that there's people out there that are willing to risk their lives for animals. And so thanks for showcasing a little bit of that and letting the world know that there are some wildlife protectors out there.